How are you doing today, Kevin?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
It's had a good weekend so far, I hope. I guess so far. It's Monday. It's not the weekend anymore.
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. I'm actually off on Monday, so just been taking it easy today.
That's legit. Any writing, perhaps?
I should have. I plan to, but as sometimes happens, I've not.
The day just flies by. I totally get that.
It does. It
Totally get
does.
that.
The day's still young. I got some time.
Yeah, see, there you go. There's some positivity. It's still nice and early. Uh, Perfect. So I'd love to know, just the readers may not be aware of you. I'd love to know and have you share listeners. I said readers. They're definitely listeners, not readers. Where are you in your author career? Just talk a little bit about when you began, where you are about now, and where you hope to go with your author life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been writing most of my life. Like I've loved writing since I was a little kid, doing it in school.
Mm.
One of my first pieces of writing I remember doing is probably Legend of Zelda fan fiction. As a kid, I call it fan fiction now. Back then, I don't know what I called it,
Mm-hmm.
but just my own little Legend of Zelda creation. But yeah, so I've been doing it as far back about as I can remember. And but as far as when I was first published, that would be 2016. So I
Okay.
published my first novel in Echoes of the Forgotten in 2016 with a small independent publisher. They were called Sarah Book Publishing. I say were because they did go out of business.
Okay.
They went closed down shop about a year after I published with them. And then I decided, once I got my rights back, to just self-publish it myself. I thought about shopping it around again, seeing if I could get it with either an agent or a small publisher again, but I decided ultimately to just self-publish it. And there is a second book I've also released just recently. So I re self-published it in 2017, and then in 2020 I published the sequel, which is titled Storm of the Spirits, and currently working on the third one. I'm pretty early on. I've also published, well, not me, but I've contributed to a couple anthologies as well with some other independent authors in the area where I live. So that's been a pretty cool collaboration. But yeah, so writing forever, but published about 5 years or so.
That's awesome. I mean, it sounds like we're in a relatively similar place with publishing. I've only published the two books. I haven't contributed to any anthologies though, so you've got that on me. But yeah, I'm working on the third book of a trilogy. My first book was published in 2020, I think, actually. So I'm just a tad bit behind you. But yeah, publishing is constantly changing. It's kind of great that you had the opportunity to self-publish post, the situation with your prior publisher. I hope there were no concerns with you self-publishing. Probably not at this point. But it sounds like you have your main interest when it comes to writing is fantasy and sci-fi. Is that correct? Is that generally what you write?
Yes, it is.
So very similar to that. And when I talked to you about potentially joining the podcast, you expressed interest in talking about plot twists, which I think is amazing, because plot twists are a massive part of most books, but particularly I feel like sci-fi and fantasy. That's my preferred genre as well, both reading and writing. So I definitely get that. But I guess why did that come to mind first? Is talking about plot twists and how to do them well.
I don't know. I enjoy reading a plot twist. Like, it's one of those to where I think we all want to be surprised by a story, right? We want to be blown away by a twist we didn't see coming. And then a lot of us probably like to try to guess, right? Like if we think a twist could potentially be coming, try to figure out like, oh, wait, this is going to happen or that's going to happen. And it's always, of course, very satisfying when you are able to guess it. But in some ways, it's almost more fun when you don't. You're like just mind blown, like, whoa. And I like putting twists in my books, in my stories. I like to see if I can, completely take a reader by surprise. And yeah, so it's just one of those things I enjoy writing in a book, reading in a book. And so it kind of came into my mind as something that maybe we could talk about.
I absolutely, I love everything you said, because I agree. I love the plot twist. I think I kind of do it without thinking, kind of subconsciously or unconsciously. I'm just reading the book and like, oh, I bet this is going to happen. A lot of the times I'm wrong. Like, let's be honest. I'm just like coming up with these wild things. It's probably just my writer brain going crazy. But you specifically mentioned, I think you said foreshadowing was something, and I agree. I think foreshadowing up to a plot is very important. But for those who might be listening who might not know what that means, how do foreshadowing and plots play together? Like, how does that relate?
Yeah, so I like to, I'd say, lay a trail of breadcrumbs, right? Like
Mm.
sometimes they can be subtle. Most of the time, they should be subtle, I think, in my opinion. But it's not something that screams out to you. Ideally, it's when you get to that twist, you can think back on these moments like, oh, there was this that happened or that happened. And you kind of connect these dots in your head
Mm-hmm.
of, oh, I could have seen that twist. I could have guessed it, but I didn't, right? Like that idea is the ideal situation to me of you created this twist as the writer, the reader does not guess it, they're surprised, but when they look back on it or maybe even reread it, they can connect all those dots together, see that trail of breadcrumbs that you left, and kind of put it all together. Go ahead.
I just like the breadcrumbs analogy, or what is that, a metaphor? I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think that's a really important part of the book. So given that you're so interested in them, and I haven't read your books yet, I will fully admit I have. I was just telling Kevin earlier, I'm holding his book right here. It's one of my next reads if I can actually buckle down and read stuff. But given that you're really interested in them, I'd love to know, from your perspective, do you have any like tips or tricks, or like, is there any way you could help listeners who are potentially thinking of a story or writing a story currently? How do they go about planning and putting in these twists so that they're effective and they don't fall flat? Do you have any tips for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm as probably has been discussed on previous podcasts, at least in some of the episodes I've heard, the pantser versus plotter debate, and I am definitely a pantser.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does something like being a pantser factor in to creating a plot twist, right? Like that seems like something daunting, maybe even. And so for anyone unfamiliar with the term pantser, it's writing by the seat of your pants and just kind of making it up as you go.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I go in not like a complete blank canvas when I'm creating the story, but I usually have the twist that I want in my head. I have like the story concept.
Mm-hmm.
I often typically know what my ending is going to be, and I know a few major plot points or story beats along the way. But I try to have that like a twist in my head of, okay, I want this to happen. Now, where it's going to happen in the story, how I'm going to get there, I don't always know that until, of course, I'm writing it. But as far as like a tip so that's part of my tip, is have that idea of the twist maybe going into the story, because that's good. But sometimes it will also just organically create itself. Like the twist can organically create itself as you go. But for me, I get that twist in my head, and then I write as I go to get there. But some of those breadcrumbs I may leave along the way while I'm writing. But as a pantser, most of them I probably create during editing. So it's a lot of those foreshadowing moments. So I create that twist, I get there, then I'm like, oh, I should do this at this point and point toward that, to where these dots connect. And I should add like a certain look on the person's face here, or, something like that just kind of feeds into maybe the reader's imagination on what could this look mean, or point out a certain characteristic or something like that. So a lot of it happens. So don't think you have to get all that foreshadowing in. You have to know every step, beat by beat, of the story and the twist and how you're going to get to that twist. It's okay to create a lot of that, because at the end of the day, the reader doesn't know whether you created it while you were writing it or plotting it or while you were editing it. As long as it all comes together in the end, that's really what matters. So And for me, most of it, I'd say probably 75% of that foreshadowing steps comes during editing.
And that's interesting. And I love everything you said there, because I'm also a pantser. I'm not a planner at all. I can't plot. I'm not good at really planning things in my normal life. It drives my wife crazy. But no, I'm also a pantser. But I as you were thinking about it, I think I just did that unconsciously. I had the twist. I've known the ends of the books for all three of the books, even the third one that I'm working on now. And I think the point you made of having that constantly in your mind, and you're working towards that kind of unconsciously, yeah, it's a little bit easier to drop in expressions or small references to it, because you're just like, oh, like I'm remembering that we're kind of coming to this head, to this point where this twist happens, or this plot craziness goes on. And so just even thinking about it as I'm writing has helped me. But I agree, like that's the most I have, is the end couple of the twists. Have you ever been surprised by a twist as you've been writing? Like something just pops up and you're like, well, that was unexpected. And it ends up becoming a plot twist that you then have to account for either in a later book or later on in the story. Has that ever happened to you?
Oh, like something that I wrote. I don't think it's happened quite like that, but let me tell you, I do have that this will require a little bit of background story.
Sure.
But while I write each draft of my book, I've had one friend that reads it as I write it, as I create it. So it's always fun to have like that one, at least one person that you can talk to about your book as you're creating it. Most of us have alpha readers, beta readers. Some people don't want anyone to read their book till they finish that first draft. Some people like people to read it as they write it. It varies person to person. Yeah. There's no right or wrong way. But yeah, I like to have that one person though that I can bounce ideas off. And I bring this up because when I was writing my first book, I put something in there, a passage. It's very short, and I didn't really even think too much about it at the time. And then he said something to me. I was like, oh, does this mean something? I'm like, oh, I guess it could mean something. let me think about this. And what's interesting is this little thing in that conversation with him led to a huge twist, not in book one, but in book two. So it became like this kind of larger series twist that I've been building toward, and kind of laying these little, again, you'll hear me say breadcrumbs 5 million times on this podcast today. Sorry, listeners. But laying all these breadcrumbs from while in book one into book two because of this conversation I had with them. And now I don't even remember your question, but hopefully I answered it.
No, I think you definitely did. I totally get that. When you're going into a lengthy explanation, you're just like, wait, Emma, did I answer the question? You did. And sorry, another question just came to mind as you were describing that, because you mentioned, the kind of unexpected passage. They're like, oh, that wasn't expected, but we can use it, right? How does this look? Like, you might not have a great answer for this. I know this is really challenging to think about, but you've written short stories, right? You've written poetry, which, I mean, even some poetry can kind of have some plot twists. They don't always, but sometimes, I think. But like, how does it look different, this whole plot twist foreshadowing writing style with short stories? I've not actually written any short stories. Do you find that it's more difficult to use foreshadowing and plot twists in a shorter text versus something like a trilogy or a longer series? Or do you find it's actually easier? I'm curious, because I've not done a short story before.
Yeah, personally, I think it's harder. A short story, you have and short story can be, like flash fiction, very short, of 500 words, or it could be, 10, 20,000 words. Like it varies. But in my average length, probably short story, I don't write really long short stories. I've written 1,500, 2,000, 5,000, somewhere in that range. But even 5 is kind of on the longer end for me. But I tend to find it more difficult because a short story has to be so tight. You don't have that length to really get in a lot of that foreshadowing that you would in a novel. So you don't have time to what, the expression, stop and smell the roses. You have to just keep things going. You have to have I think a pretty quick pace, and can't spend too much time building on things. But you can still have some foreshadowing and big twists and things like that. Absolutely. I know there are tons of short stories out there with huge twists, and I imagine, I can't think of any great examples off the top of my head, but I imagine that a lot of them did include to some degree a level of foreshadowing toward that twist.
And I imagine, and this is just me thinking it through in some of the short stories that I've read, that the foreshadowing and twists tend to be a bit more subtle, perhaps, in a
Mm-hmm.
short story. I mean, they kind of have to be because, like you said, if you put something brazen in there, it just kind of gives
Mm-hmm.
everything away a little bit too early.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I haven't done a ton of reading of short stories, but I get what you're saying. That makes absolute sense. Do you prefer writing one versus the other when it comes to plot twists? You prefer trying to come up with the short story twist versus I know you've only written a couple books, but you're working on the third book now, at least mentally, if you haven't
Yeah.
written the words. So is there one you prefer over the other?
I would say I prefer the longer the for
Hmm.
novels, because it's nice to build toward that big payoff, to me. So I've, without going into detail, right? I do have a twist, at least one big twist in my first book, and I'd
Hmm.
say at least a couple in the second. And then the ones in the second were more kind of a series build between one and two,
Sure.
which I alluded to earlier, mentioned earlier. But the first one, of course, it being the first book, was more self-contained. So yeah, I definitely prefer the longer. I like the series one, I think, especially because I could be like, hey, remember that thing I said in book one? Like, you probably don't, but remember it. And look, there's a payoff happening right now. Check it out.
I
Like,
think it's
there it was something intentional happening here.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that. It does often bring back a remembrance of what happened in some prior books. I'm remembering that now as I'm thinking of books that I've read where there's a twist in the second, third, fourth, or if it's a long series, like, oh yeah, that's right. It helps me kind of recall what happened in
Mhm.
the first book. So that's interesting. I'm looking forward to reading your books and seeing if I can capture that, read that passage. That's really exciting.
You won't
And
know what it is till the second book, but
yeah, this is kind of another random question that just popped in my mind, and I don't, if you don't have an answer, it's totally understandable, but are there any common pitfalls when it comes to plot twists and foreshadowing that you may have seen, maybe you experienced from any other authors, or even some major books that you've read? Any problems that you've noticed?
I mean, maybe if you just rely on it too much. I can't think of specific examples per se,
That's all
but I
right. Yeah.
think if you just rely on that twist without necessarily focusing on the characters of the story itself, and you're just looking only to surprise people and that's it, then that could create a bit of a problem, I think, for the overall story. Like if it's one of those where you analyze it like in retrospect, because a lot of times, like right when you finish a book or watch a movie or a TV show or whatever, you get to that twist and you're riding the high off of that, right? Like, oh, like that was the best movie ever, best book ever. And then you think back on it, you're like, oh wait, there was this or that, or the characters were all shallow or whatever, just because the twist was so good. Sometimes it has that impact in the moment, but it won't necessarily stick with you in the long term, because the characters didn't impact you or the story didn't impact you. It was just the twist. So you get the moment without the long lasting. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that makes absolute sense. I can actually, I can actually think of a book that made me feel that way. I thought of an example. I didn't before this very second, but the way you were describing that, I was like, oh yeah, I can recall why I didn't like that book. And I'll even say it. This may be controversial for some people, I don't know, but it was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. I won't give anything away, but I don't know if you've read that book by any chance. I won't give any spoilers away, but I can just remember there was a twist at the end of the book, like very end of the book, and I just remember thinking, "What?" Like it was surprising, but there was so little foreshadowing. There was so like it just there was no build up to it that it actually left me pretty dissatisfied. Like I was like, "Oh, I mean, I can kind of see that happening." but it was just it fell really flat for me, and I found it very disappointing. And I think, like you said, the build up and the pre foreshadowing and planning, and even the connect post plot twist that kind of at least explains it or leaves a cliffhanger intentionally, right? If that's your intent for a series, great. Just remember to wrap things up later. But yeah, this book was a standalone, and I guess it was a prequel to the Hunger Games series, but I just didn't like it. It was bad. So there you go. If you read that book, don't, obviously everyone can have their own opinions about it, but I felt like that plot twist fell flat. So that's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't even realize why I didn't enjoy reading that book. But now that you described it, I was like, okay, that was it. I totally get why now.
Nice.
I've also found for other authors, and I don't know if this is the same for you, that there can be a tendency to get a little bit too plot twist crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it happens very often, but I think some authors might get a little bit too excited about making everything twisty, and then it gets hard to follow. At that point, it's like, well, what's the original plot line, right? There's just too many twists. I don't even remember where we started and where we're going. So I don't think I've had that problem, and I would wager you probably haven't either. But I know that it can be challenging for some authors to get a little crazy on that front.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can become really convoluted sometimes if you try to overdo it.
I just don't even think, given that I'm not a planner, I am a pantser, but being a pantser and working with plot twists, I feel like it's fairly natural. I think most pantsers would say that pantsing their way through a book with plot twists has been felt kind of natural. So is that the same for you? Do you feel that's the case?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
That
Yep.
is excellent. So I'd love. Had you ever been a plotter for your books by any chance?
No, I say no, but let me. Yeah, the answer
I
is still
love
no.
clarification.
But yeah, I'll give you some clarification. The
Kind
answer is
of.
still no, either way. But let's say for my first book, Echoes of the Forgotten, I did. There's a lot of people's names, a lot of cities, things like that.
Yep.
So I did write out like a list of everyone's names, and
Okay.
there's like the city rulers, so like what city they're attached to, and like their symbol. They all have like a symbol for their city, like their signet
Cool.
ring or like that sort of thing, right? So so kind of wrote all that sort of thing out, and then a little bit of like a basic idea of the world and the story. Not so
Hmm.
much the story, I'd say more an idea of the world itself, more so than the story. So
Yeah.
it was kind of more like my idea concept I wrote down, and then all the different main, not even necessarily like the main people, but the people I needed to keep straight in my head. Otherwise, I was probably going to put the wrong ruler in the wrong city or something like that if I didn't do that. So that's about the extent of my planning.
Hmm.
And not too much more than that. I didn't even really do that for the second book, really just the first. I found myself when I was writing the second one going back and reading like random passages in the first book, like, oh, what did I write there? Or how did I word that? Or how did I say this? Or various things like that. So yeah, that's probably about the extent though. Other than that, I think I mentioned earlier during our conversation that I usually have we talked about it some, the ending and the twist kind of in my head. So I don't really ever put that down in like an outline or anything like that. I just kind of keep that in my head. My wife has jokingly said before that if she doesn't know how I do it like this, like she's like, she says if I wrote a book, I would, have this big old, whiteboard and like you would in like a crime TV show or something, like all these things written out, things connected, stuff like that. So I'm like, no, I can't do it that way. My mind just, if I try to outline like an entire story, an entire book, my mind just crumbles. Like I can't do it.
And I'm the same way. My wife is the same way. She's very much a planner, so it's I guess opposites attract like that. Because like I said, I'm not. For me, like you said, the way you described it was my mind just kind of crumbles. I feel like I lose the creative ability that I normally have when I actually sit down to write words, because I'm so inundated by these details that I've pre-thought. So I just can't. I just have to intentionally block that stuff out. I'm like, well, I'm just going to take the story where it takes me. And it feels kind of like you're reading the book for the first time.
Yeah.
But the reason I asked that is because obviously there's going to be some differences probably between someone who's a plotter versus someone who's a pantser and how it relates to plot twists. I've never really worked with plotters, but I imagine that a plotter could potentially, write down very to the detail different foreshadowing elements up to a plot twist at various elements. But I think the best piece of advice that you've given us today is for pantsers. If you can't plot out those specific scenes, just always have that plot twist in mind, and then you'll feel those foreshadowing events kind of falling in where they fit. And sure. I think that's, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, for sure. And then anything that you realize later that you didn't put in there, you can add during editing. So yeah.
That's true. This is actually something that I do not like editing. Like, I think a lot of authors will say this. Coincidentally, I don't like adding, or I can take stuff out of editing, but I actually prefer not to add stuff during editing. If I can avoid it. And so far I've been able to avoid it for the most part. But definitely rely on editing. Don't be afraid to write out the first draft. Just write anything out, because you always have the time to edit it 7 million times.
Definitely. Yeah. I delete way more than I add during editing. My first book, Echoes, I probably deleted somewhere around 15,000 words, something like that. I trimmed it. I trimmed a lot. But I added maybe like 5,000. So somewhere in there. So I deleted. I definitely always delete more than I add during editing. Second book, I didn't delete as much, but it was still probably at least, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 or so.
I'm just looking at your book here, trying to figure out the size. Your book is relatively large. It's probably near 100,000 or just over 100,000 words, probably.
Yeah, the first book is just under 100. It's
just under
99,000 and some change, and the second one's a little longer. It's like 106, 107, something like that. So, and yep, they were both cut down a good bit, but yeah, just to make them tighter, I think. Run a little
flow better.
Flow better. Exactly.
Yep, that makes sense. Give more attention to the pieces that are more important. Yeah, I've cut a bunch out of mine as well, so I get that. So this question is fun, and this is we don't do spoilers because I don't want to ruin books for anybody, but I'm so curious to know. I don't even think I have an answer, but I'm curious to know if you have an answer. What books or book had your favorite plot twists, like most satisfying plot twists in books that you've read? Without giving the twists, you can just say the title and the author.
This would be kind of hard, without saying the twist. Although the books that I think that come to my head first are like huge, big name books where I think 90% of the world probably knows anyway. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but I'm gonna say Game of Thrones.
Okay, I haven't read it coincidentally, but
yeah.
So I'm one of the 10%.
So that one, and then this might be a cop-out answer, but I'm also gonna say Harry Potter is a big one.
I don't think it's a cop-out.
Yeah,
I think if there was a plot, if there were plot twists that were satisfying, that's the question, and then I think that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, and I'm more thinking of a big payoff for Harry Potter, but every Harry Potter book has a twist in it. And there's also series twist payoffs, and I'm more thinking of the big series twist payoff, but I'll stop there for the 5 people who haven't read Harry Potter or seen the movie.
Yeah, right there. I doubt there's very many of them, but still, we won't give anything away. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm thinking, coincidentally, I think, and this could have just been an artifact of where I was at my reading. As I've been reading my whole life, I've always wanted to write, but I can recall the specific emotions that I had when reading Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. I read it past midnight. I was just trying to get out. And the ending of that book, I remember the feeling that I had with the twist of that book. I was just like, what the? Right. I wouldn't say that's the most satisfying, but I can recall exactly the emotions that I had. A number of Brandon Sanderson books have made me feel that way as well. The Mistborn series has some really cool things, particularly at the end of that series. It's like, it jumps you back all the way to the beginning, like, oh, suddenly everything makes sense. And I like to reread books. So anyway, those are just a couple that I've enjoyed. I need to reread Harry Potter, though. You just reminded me. Should probably
Yeah,
do that.
I don't do much rereading, but Harry Potter I have probably read at least a couple times. So it's one of the few. Mostly, part of that is me reading it to my son too. So
Yeah. How old is your son, if you don't mind me
uh,
asking?
yeah, he's 10.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, my son loves reading as well. He's 7, and he's consumed all of the Rick Riordan books possible. He just loves those books. So I get that. I love
For
that he
sure.
has a love of reading. But cool. I appreciate you joining me today. I think plot twists are always going to be important, and I hope people have learned a little bit about where authors get these crazy ideas and how we deal with them when we're writing books. But I'd love you to tell listeners, where can they find you? Where can they find information about your books? Where can they get copies of your books?
Yeah, absolutely. So my books, Echoes of the Forgotten and the sequel, Storm of the Spirits, can be found on Amazon, but also you could order books through most other places where you can purchase books, various other retailers. And then as far as me, my socials, I'm probably most active right now on TikTok as author Kevin Looney, but I also have an Instagram under the same name. You can find my Facebook author page, which I don't post on frequently, but on occasion you'll see something pop up on there. That's Kevin Looney Fantasy Author, or Twitter, Kevin Looney 05.
Awesome. You're brave to be on Twitter. I tried Twitter for about 0.7 seconds and was like, yeah, I'm bouncing off of this. Maybe
Yeah,
I should give
I
it a try again.
I didn't use it too much. I used it for regularly for about a year or so, but I haven't used it much lately.
Still, I'll jump in and see if I can't find you. I'm following you everywhere else, but I don't think I'm following Twitter. So I'll dive into that. Well, thanks again for joining me today. I hope you have an excellent week.
Absolutely. It was fun. I enjoyed talking with you.